Welcome, Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi Shevuos Mem Aleph, but we're going to start on the bottom of Mem Amma Beis, 10 lines from the bottom at the two dots. Today's Daf is dedicated for a Shmer for the Chayalim, that's all for the Shvuyim, and Yeshua for Am Yisrael, and this Eis Tzara. The Mishnah had stated that if a person says, Manali biyadcha, says, you owe me $100, and the guy says, I don't know you owe $100, he denies everything. It's what's called kofar akol. Then our Mishnah had said he's going to be exempt. He's exempt from an oath. You only have to take a biblical oath in that case if it will be modib and mitzvah, a partial admission. That's one of the three biblical oaths. So it says Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Nachman, umashpiono so shvuas hesis. Rashi says this is a takana that Rav Nachman made. That Rav Nachman's in the Gemara. It's a late takana. He says even though we don't make him take a biblical oath, we make him take a rabbinic oath. Heses, Rashi says, from the language of placing upon somebody. Some say it's like from a masis to convince someone. Otherwise, it says to give counsel is what the Ritva says. But anyway, so Rav Nachman says, even though biblically speaking, he's not required to an oath if he denies everything, rabbinically speaking, we make him take an oath. My time, why? Because there's a presumption a person's not going to make a claim unless he has some merit to it. And so therefore, from the fact that this person made the claim, we say you have to take an oath. Adarabba, just the opposite as the Gemara. We have a different principle. This is what the Torah is saying, that there's a presumption a person's not going to lie to the person who's his creditor. Rashi's he's not going to completely lie, and that's why he's going to partially admit it. Rashi says the reason is because this guy did you a favor, you're not going to lie. And Tosfos says, no, the reason is because he knows you're lying, so you won't be able to get away with it. So that's why a person is not believed if he does. A person is believed if he does a total denial. So because there's a presumption he can't lie. And Gemara says, yeah, he's not really lying. He's not really lying. He's just trying to delay paying. He's saying, okay, I'll just say I paid it for now, but then later on, I'll pay the whole thing. Once I get the money, I'll pay him back. So therefore, he's going to be more brazen to deny everything because in his mind, he justifies that he's going to pay later on. And I'll prove to you that this is the logic. The Amar of Idi Bar Avin, Amar of Chisda, HaKofer b'malveh kasher la'edus. That let's say you deny a loan, then we say you're not really such a liar because we assume that you're just trying to delay it and you're actually kosher to give testimony. But by a pikadon pasoledus. But if it was something that you had in your possession of the other person, let's say a deposit, or let's say he claims you stole it, and he knows you have it in your possession, then if the person is lying, then we're going to say it's disqualified because there you don't have the reason of pushing off the loan. There we don't have that justification that you're just trying to delay it until you can pay it back because you're clearly lying about the fact that you have his item in your possession. Rav Chavivi Masni Aseifa. Rav Chavivi said that this statement of Rav Nachman was not taught about this clause where he makes a claim for a mana and he says he has nothing, but it was taught about the next clause in the Mishnah, where he says, mana he says, you owe me mana, and Amrlo Hain, he admits to it. And when Machar, the next day, Amrlo Taneois, the next day he says, give me the mana. And he says, I gave it to you, Potter. We're going to say there he's exempt because he's kofar akol. Amar Nachman umashpiono so shvuas heses. So in that context, when Nachman says we make him take this oath called the shvuas heses. So the man demasni aresha, the one who taught this teaching of Rav Nachman on the first clause, kol shekena seifa, for sure on the second clause, because there's more of a reason to make him take a rabbinic oath on the second clause, because he admits to the loan its existence, exists to the money. It's called drara de memono, but the one who admits, says Rav Nachman, the law was taught about the second case, we would say hachahu deika, or on the top of 41a, hachahu deika drara de memona. In the second case, there is some money there already. There is this concept of that he admits to the loan. He just says, I paid it back. But hacha the avohasam, the leka drara de memona. Well, but in that case over there's no concept of drara de memona. There's no concept that he even admitted to the loan. And so therefore, for that reason, we're not going to make you that it's not necessarily the case. Rav Nachman will make you take the Shevuos has this. Gemara says, "My ika bein shvua d'oraisa shvua d'rabanan." So what do you need? What's the distinction between a biblical oath and a rabbinic oath? Here we're not talking about every rabbinic oath, but we're talking about the Shevuos has to say the commentaries. So my ika bein shvua d'oraisa shvua d'rabanan. Ika benayu, the distinction between them is mepach shvua. Whether the person says, I don't want to take this oath, and I want you to take the oath, and you take it, whether he has the right to do that. So b'd'oraisa well mavchinon. By a biblical oath, we don't allow you to be mepach shvua. We don't allow the defendant to say, I don't want to take the oath, you take the oath and take the money. But b'd'rabanan mavchinon. But by this case of Shevuos Esses, he has the right to say, listen, I don't want to take the oath. You could take the oath and take your money. But the Gemara says, well, Mar Bar Avashi the Amar b'd'oraisa nami mavchinon. But what about the sheet of Mar Bar Avashi who says that even by a biblical oath you can reverse in nami mavchinon Shevuos? So if that's the case, according to Mar Bar Avashi, my ika bein d'oraisa d'rabanan. What's the distinction? Ika benayu mechas l'nichse. Whether or not you're able to, the court is able to go into the assets of the person who doesn't take the oath and just seize his property. B'd'oraisa, biblically speaking, if the person is motive of mikzas and he refuses to take an oath, nachtino and nechse, we just go into his property and we seize it. But b'd'rabanan, nachtino and nechse. But since this is a Shevuos Esses, only d'rabanan. If he's called for a call and he says, I don't want to take an oath, then we can't seize his assets. The Tanan, and I will give you another example of this idea. Well, the Gemara says, wait, I skipped the line. It says, well, Rabbi Yossi, but what about the Shita of Rabbi Yossi? It says, B'drabana nami nachtino nilsnei. Rabbi Yossi says that rabbinically speaking, we could also go into his assets. So if that's the case, what would he say is the difference between a biblical oath and a rabbinical oath? Now, first, the Gemara is going to tell us how we know Rabbi Yossi says that rabbinically speaking, we can go into his assets. And the Gemara says, based upon a Mishnah and Bava Metzia, it's not a direct parallel, but it's pretty close. The Tanah we learned, Metzias Charashot V'Katan. Let's say there's a minor or a person who doesn't have agency, who finds an object. They can't really acquire it. So therefore, Yesh Bam Gezel Mnei Darkei Shalom. It's only theft on account of Darkei Shalom. It's not actual theft. It's just not appropriate to behave like that. Ways of peace. Whereas Boker Tov, Jeff. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says it's Gezel Gomor. Rabbi Yossi says it's actual theft. Amar Rav Chisda Gezel Gomor Midivreim. He says it's rabbinic theft. And what does that mean? And we said, so what's the distinction? What does Rav Chisda add? In my nafkamina, meaning to say, what does it mean when he says Gezel Gomor Midivreim? What does that mean? It means Ma'ika, what's the distinction between Rav Yossi and the Rabbanan? It means Hotziu b'dayanin. So that Rav Yossi is saying that since it's Gezel Gomer Midivrein, rabbinic theft, the court has the right to seize it. So according to Rav Yossi, what's the distinction between Shvua that's biblical and Shvua d'Rabbanan? He says, Ika b'nayu shekenegdo choshen al Shvua. We're around the third of the way down on 41a. So the distinction between them is where the defendant is suspected of not being able to take a proper oath. Now, b'd'oraisa, so if it will be a case of motive mikdas shekenegdo choshen al Shvua, and let's say the person who makes this motive mikdas claim, we don't trust him, so he can't take the oath. So we just flip it, the oath, and put it on the plaintiff, and the plaintiff takes the oath and takes the money. But by a rabbinic case, by this case of Shevuos Esses, the whole concept of rabbinic oath is a takantahi. The whole concept of rabbinic oath is that it's to fix the situation. V'takanto takanto of dina, and we don't make another takana to fix a takana. And so, therefore, if a person is suspected of being an oath, and then he denies it completely, so now he can't take the oath, we don't flip it back onto the plaintiff. And then the defendant, under those circumstances, ironically, will be completely exempt, and he won't take the oath, and he'll get to keep the money. So he's believed if he denies everything. So turns out that somebody who denies everything and is suspected of a false oath, suspected of not giving true oaths, is actually in a much stronger position. So Gemara says, "Well, Rabbanan de Puigi away the Rabbi Yossi the Amr the Rabbanan who nachtino and and what?" So the Gemara says, "Wait 1 second. According to the Rabbanan who say, who are you, Rabbi Yossi?" And they say, by a rabbinic oath, we're not going to go down into his assets to seize his property. Well, if that's the case, my avdinaway. So what do we do to this guy who says I'm not taking an oath? So the Gemara says, Mishamtinaway. We excommunicate him. Harmony Ravino Ravashi. Ravina says Ravashi, well, that's actually going into his assets because nakde bechuvse the neshavke leglime. You're grabbing a hold of, Rashi says, you're grabbing a hold of his beitzim that are suspended from him until he gives you the talus that's on him. Meaning to say, you're basically going into his assets. You're placing a lot of pressure on him. And so it's the equivalent. So the Gemara says, no, Elamai Avdina, what do? We don't just do a regular excommunication. We excommunicate him ad matis man nagde. And if you're excommunicated for 30 days, then we give you lashes. So we say we're going to excommunicate you for 30 days. Nagdinale, we give him lashes. V'shavkinale, and then we say you're on your own. So if you don't want to take the oath, and by rabbinic oath, we excommunicate you, and after 30 days, we give you lashes, and then, yeah, you can get out of it. Amra Papa. So Rav Papa says about this. A person who produces a note on his friend, and he says to him, the defendant says, yeah, it's a note. It's a note that is accurate, but it's parua, shtara paruahu. I paid this note. Amrina lay, lav kol kaminach. We don't believe him. Zil shalim. We say, we don't believe you. Go and pay. Go and pay. V'im amar v'shtav, because why else would the guy have the note? V'im amar v'shtavali, and if he says, if the borrower says, no, you take an oath to me that I have not yet paid it, amrinale ishtavale. We say to him, you have to take an oath that you haven't paid it. So that's the teaching of Rav Papa. The guy has the right to demand that the plaintiff takes an oath. Amroe Rav Acha Brei de Ravo Rav Ash Ma Bein Zeh Bezeh Pogim Shtaro. Meaning to say, how is this different in the case of Pogim Shtaro? Pogim Shtaro is a person who, that's a case where you say, yes, I have this note, but a portion of the note was already paid, meaning to say the contract is not pure anymore because we acknowledge that some of it was paid. We'll look at Rashi. This case, the note was not defective at all, meaning to say, he says, and he has to take an oath, even though the note was not at all defective. And then you have a case of pogem shtaro, where the note is defective, and we don't force him to take the oath. Look at the case, the Tanan, and we assume that in a case where the note is not defective, it should be a stronger position in the case where the note is defective, where we learned in Ksuvas, hapogemes Ksuvasa, lo tipara el b'shvua, that where a woman has already collected part of the Ksuva, now if she wants to collect the whole thing, she has to take an oath. Kate Sadra, she says, let's say the Ksuva was $1,000. V'hu amar is kabalta Ksuva sech. And he says to her, no, you already got paid. She says, I only got 100. Since she admits to the 100, so now her whole ksuva has been damaged. And if she wants to collect the rest, he admits to the ksuva, but she admits part of it was paid. So she can only collect the rest if there's an oath. The leiku a mismach su ashtara. Because hold on, let me finish Rashi. Because you can no longer rely on this contract. The equal meimar tfei kibla. Because you could say you can claim she paid more. Ahashadamris mashbian lo. But now we say the guy who has the oath, we make him take the guy who has the contract. May make him take the oath. It turns out that this contract is actually weaker than the case of the pogem eshtara, where if his contract had been defective, she's the one who takes the oath. You had a question?
In the case of the Ksuba, she says I got paid 100. He said
no, he says the Ksuba, she says, pay me a Ksuba. I have my Ksuba. He says, I already paid it to you. She says, you only pay me 100. So now she just takes the oath She takes the oath, but the ksuba there is defective, and she takes the oath to get the rest of the money. But in this case, what happened here? He says the person produced a note, and he says it's a pay note. We say go and pay it. We don't believe. No. We say here, no, just the opposite. I'm on the apik shtari al chavre. We'll read the case again. It says, Papa, I'm on the apik shtari al chavre. The guy produces a note on his friend, and he says, and his friend says, it's a pay note, and my note is paid. We say to him, we don't believe you that the note was paid. Go and pay the money. But if he says to him, take an oath for me, we say you have to take an oath. So we force him to take an oath here. It's a perfectly good contract, and yet we force him to take. We force the creditor to take the oath. So basically, so why in this case where the lender claims, where the lender claims he wasn't paid anything, and why is it in this case do we say he has to take an oath? And in the case of the pogemus star, we say that he has to swear about the rest of the debt. Meaning to say, in this case, also the lender has. Meaning to say, in both cases, you have to take an oath. You have to take an oath if you're the lender. If you're the creditor or whatever. So then what advantage does he have that the document is not defective? That's the point. If in both cases you have to take an oath, what advantage does it have that the document is defective versus not defective? So right, and she has to take an oath to get the rest of the money. So, and there it's clearly a case of a document that was defective. In this case, the document's not defective, and he also has to take an oath. So what advantage do you have from the fact that the document is not defective? You're supposed to have some advantage. So the Gemara says,
says swear for me because maybe he's not 100% sure whether he owes the money or not.
Doesn't tell us why. It's just his claim. It's just his claim. They don't tell us why.
Why would he? Otherwise, he has to pay either way.
If he says swear to me, I have to pay. But if he says swear to me, he only pays if the guy swears. That's what the case is. He says, we say swear to him. Otherwise, he's out. Otherwise, he doesn't have to pay. So what's the advantage over this case where the document is not defective versus the case where the document is defective? So Rav Ashi explains, in the case of a defective document, we say, we force the creditor to make the oath, even though the borrower doesn't make any claim. But Hacha, so he says as follows. He says, the answer is, but here we tell the borrower, go pay him. But if the borrower makes the claim on his own, then, and he says, take an oath. So the difference is, the court, make the claim on behalf of the borrower. In the case where it's a defective document, we do, but in this case, we don't. And if he's a young Torah scholar, we don't make him take an oath. Well, we don't force the Torah scholars to take an oath. So the Torah scholars could just go around taking the coats and they don't have to take an oath. No, what it means is we don't want to enter into this case to make him take an oath because it looks like we're suspicious of him. But we also don't want to collect from him because he'll say to him, swear to me that you haven't paid it. So therefore, we really don't want to get involved in it. But if he has to collect the money, yes, indeed, he has to take an oath. Next case, Manui biyadcha. Let's say you owe me $100. So what's the case? The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Asi, Amalves Chavero be'edim. So let's say you lend money to your friend and there are witnesses, so under those circumstances, you need to pay him back with witnesses. If you borrow your friend, if you lend your money, if you borrow somebody lends his friend with witnesses, you need to pay him back with witnesses. So, Ki Amrisa Kamei de Shmuel, when this law was said in front of Shmuel, he said, no. No, he could have anyways made the claim, I paid you with witnesses, and they went overseas. So since he anyways could have made that claim, we believe him when he says he paid you back, even though there were not witnesses. So basically, Rav says you need to pay back in witnesses, and if you didn't pay back in witnesses, we don't believe you. Shmuel says, no, you can pay it back without witnesses. So Tanan, let's learn it from our Mishnah. Manoli biyadcha. He says, you owe me $100. Amar lo hein. He says, yes. Lamachar amar lo teneo. He says, give it to me. He says, nisativ loch. He says, I gave it to you, Potter. And we'll say it's exempt. Va'acha kivan the tave be'edim. Here he makes the claim in front of witnesses. So, and then Rashi explains, and he admits it in front of them. It's like it was lent with witnesses. Commander usve be'edim dummy. It's like he went to with witnesses, the Katani Potter, and he still said we say it's exempt. So it's a direct refutation of Rav Asi, who says that if you went to with witnesses, you need to pay him back with witnesses. So this is a direct refutation of Rav Yehuda named Rav Asi. So Amro Rav Asi, Rav Asi would say. So we're on top of Memal from the base. Says Rav Asi. Wow, we're going slowly. So he says, I say that which I said that the borrower needs to return it with witnesses, and without witnesses not believed, that's only in a case the Mikara Uspe Be'edim, where it was initially lent with Edim. Now, but because he showed that he doesn't believe the borrower, but Hacha in this case, he lent him without witnesses initially. It was just the claim that was done later on with witnesses. He believed him by lending it to him without witnesses. Rav Yosef Masni Hachi. Rav Yosef brought a different version of the dispute between Rav Asi and Shmuel. He says you don't need to pay them back with witnesses. That's what Rav Asi says. But if he specifies, only pay me back with witnesses, you need to pay him back with witnesses. When he said this in front of Shmuel, he says, Amar Lei. No, even if he says, Shmuel said, even if he said, pay me back in front of witnesses, even there, he could have said, I paid you back in front of them and they went overseas. So how do we, let's bring a proof from our Mishnah. He says, you owe me 100. He says, yes. Chayiv, he's liable. You need to give it to him with witnesses. So isn't this a refutation of Shmuel? Because we don't allow him to claim, I paid it to you in front of witnesses, but they went overseas. So you have to do Shmuel. Shmuel. So Shmuel would be forced to say to Tanai. Our Mishnah is one opinion, but there's another Tana who argues the Tanya Be'edim Elvisicha Be'edim Parley. Says in the Brisa, with witnesses I'm lending it to you. With witnesses, pay me back. O yitain, o yavi raya shenasan, or give it to me, or give a proof that you gave it. Rabbi Yehuda Mesir Omer Yachol Omer Wa Paraticha B'fnei Poni Poni V'Ochol Amo Medina Sayam. No, you could say exactly like Shmuel said that even if you say pay it back in front of witnesses, you still could say I paid you back, and then witnesses went overseas. So Parach Ravacha, so Ravacha says not necessarily the case. It's a machokas tanoim. Mimai de b'shas havakai. How do we know? How do we know that the Brisa is talking about a case at the moment of the loan? And that's where they're arguing if we believe him that he says he paid it. Maybe we're talking about a case where he says at the time of the claim, when the plaintiff or the creditor makes a claim from the borrower in front of the court, he says, and the borrower says they paid you, and this is what the borrower says. The lender says, didn't I lend it to you with witnesses? You should have paid me back with witnesses. And so there, under those circumstances, even though I didn't make this conditional of the loan, nevertheless, that I lent it to you with witnesses. You should have brought witnesses that you paid it back. But it's possible that that's what Rabbi Yehuda Masera argues and says he doesn't need to pay it back because it wasn't conditional. But if at the moment of the loan he said you have to pay me back with witnesses, indeed, maybe even Shmuel would say you're liable, even Rabbi Yehuda Masera. Amar Papi Mishmei de Rava. So Rav Papi says in the name of Rava, if you went to your friend with witnesses, you need to pay him back. Rav Papa B'Shmei Rava says, no, ain't you don't need to pay him back with his witnesses. V'im Amar Al Tefreni Al Beidim. And if he says, only pay me back with witnesses, then Tzarach Kapar Beidim. So not like Shmuel. You can't claim, oh, I pay you back. V'im Amar Lo Parasicha B'fnei Poni Poni. Oh, excuse me, just like Shmuel. V'im Amar Lo Parasicha B'fnei Poni Poni V'Ocham Din Sayam. If he says, I pay you back, they went overseas, never he's believed. But there's different girsas here, and the other girsa is that it says he's not believed. So, and the Rambam says that the Rambam, however, writes in the Mishnah Torah that the nusach that says he's not believed is not to be trusted, and which follow the girsa that says he's believed. Okay, we have some cases here, some case law. Simon Reuven Shimon Detanu Hilchasa Yofi Para Poni Poni Avtze Satrai Bem Nusa Kabetrei. So the person says to his friend, Kiparatin, Paranli Ba'ape Ruben and Shimon. He says, when you pay me back the loan, you have to pay me in front of Ruben and Shimon. Azu Pare Ba'ape Trey. Me'alma, this guy went and he paid him back in front of two other people, not Ruben and Shimon, Levi and Yehuda. Amar Abai Ba'ape Trey, Amar Levi Ba'ape Trey Pare. He said, listen, he paid it back in front of two. At the end of the day, it doesn't need to be those two. Amar Rava, no. Ruben and Shimon. No, I wanted it specifically to be paid back Reuven and Shimon. I don't want all sorts of problems to happen. So machlokas between Abai and Rava. Second case. Pay me back in front of two Torah scholars. Also pare bein delay. So he went, and when he paid him back without two Torah scholars. In the end, what happened was in Nasu. So the guy got the money back, but then let's say an accident happened. Let's say his house burnt down. So in Nasu Hanach Suze, he lost the money. So the lender comes to Rav Nachman, also coming to Rav Nachman, Amroi, in Kibui Kibaltinu Mine. Yeah, I got the money from him, but that wasn't a repayment of my loan. Derech Pikadon, that was just, he was asking me to hold his $1,000. He wasn't repaying me the loan. He was just saying, can you hold my money for me? And I said, okay, I'm going to leave this with me as just like a deposit. Until I find these two Torah scholars, and I'll fill the condition and then he'll pay me back. So Amrlay, so when he said this to Rav Nachman was Bezdin. When he says this to Rav Nachman says, "Given the kamodes devade shakaltinu mine, since you admit that you took it from him, pirom al yahavi, he paid you back, and he amos l'kiyume tenai. And if he said no, I was just waiting, and if you want to claim, he has to fulfill his obligation and pay you back in front of two Torah scholars. Dil I sin and go bring him. The honor of Rav Sheshis." I am Rav Sheshis to Tanine Elchos. We know how to learn. V'sifra v'tosefta v'kol Talmuda, and we know all the halachos. So go bring him to us, and you already admitted he paid you back, and good, we're done. So we don't believe you that you wanted to claim. I was just taking it as a deposit. We'll do one last case. He says to his friend, give me 100 zuz that I lent you. He says, it never happened. This case Max liked yesterday. Although I see Sahade to Uspe Upare. So again, let's say this case. Reuven says to Shimon, give me $100. Shimon says, no, you never lent me the money. Reuven goes bring witnesses that Shimon borrowed $100 and paid him back the $100. Oh, so although I see Sahade to Uspe Upare, I'm Rabbi, my Navid. Inu Amri Uspe, but Inu Amri Pare. So Abai says, no, they claim that, yeah, you have witnesses that he lent the money, but those same witnesses say he paid it back, so you're out of luck. Rava Amar, no. Rava says, Kola Omer lo avisi, ka Omer lo parasi dami. Now, since he says he never borrowed, he's admitting that he didn't pay back. So therefore, we have witnesses that he borrowed, so they're going to believe on the loan, but they're not believed on the payment. Those Baldin can be because he admits he didn't pay it back. So it's a little bit uh, it's a little bit of a funny case, but that's how Rashi explains it. All right, we'll stop here. This is today's daf. A big shkoyach, everyone.